All right, what is up, everybody? Good afternoon on day 4 of TBRCon 2023. Although it's the evening for my guest today, Malka Older, who's going to be doing a reading. How are you, Malka?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. So, just for folks who don't know you, can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am the author of Infomocracy and the rest of the Centenal Cycle, which is Null States and State Tectonics. Those are science fiction political thrillers. I also have a collection of short stories and poetry out called And Other Disasters. And I have a novella coming out in less than 2 months, which is super exciting, which is The Mimicking of Known Successes. So that's what I'll be reading from today.
Wonderful. And the Centenal Cycle, there they are right there. Infomocracy, Null States, and State Tectonics. Beautiful covers and fantastic books if you're into politics and post-cyberpunk kind of stuff. And then The Mimicking of Known Successes. Beautiful, beautiful cover. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, well, first of all, I do want to thank Will Stale, who did the covers for the Centenal Cycle, and Christine Folzer, who did the cover for those, because they are fantastic. And
Yeah,
we say don't judge a book by a cover, but we do buy books by their covers.
always we do.
The work that these artists have done for me, for my books. And yeah, so this novella is a science fiction murder mystery with a side of romance. It's set on a gas giant and involves, and it's a settlement, a human settlement that's been there for a couple of centuries already. And they've developed this culture and universities and this whole like research project of trying to figure out how to get back to Earth, which involves like fixing or restarting some of the ecosystems that people destroyed, sending them in search of another planet and then to Jupiter. And so the story involves one of these researchers who's trying to figure out how to get back to Earth, whose name is Platy. And her ex-girlfriend Masa happens to be an investigator, which is, their version of she's consciously named an investigator. It's not quite a police, because it's really people who like try to figure out what's happened when something has gone missing or something's not understood. So anyway, she is investigating a missing person, and they're trying to figure out where this person has disappeared to, because they live on Jupiter, which, as we know, is a gas giant and does not have any land. So all of humanity that is on this planet are living on platforms that are connected by these rings, and they orbit geosynchronously, or geo. I don't know if we can even say geo, since there's no there.
Land.
These are connected by a train system. And so this guy was on a very remote platform and disappeared from it. So they don't know if he jumped, if he was pushed, if something else happened that they haven't figured out yet. And so when you're ready, I'm going to read from a section of the book when they are going to try to find out more about what this person who disappeared was doing just before he went to this remote place to disappear from.
Wonderful. And the section that you chose, why did you feel that was the right section to demonstrate what this book is about and everything?
Well, so I've done different readings from this book. Sometimes I read from the beginning, but the beginning is actually available as an excerpt from IO9. So if you want to know more about it, you can go over there and read it. And I like to read stuff that's not available yet, and this is another section that I have read from before. And I like it because I think it gives a sense both for the place that these people are living in. It gives a sense for what this weird human settlement is like, and also somewhat for the kind of action and the kind of things that happen in the book, because it is very much about a sort of crucial point in trying to unfold the mystery.
Wonderful. Well, Malka, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. The Khafra Institute for Earth Species Preservation was established only shortly after Giant was settled by a geneticist named Krell Khafra. It was astonishing now to see it, platform after platform, branching out from the conjunction of two rings that formed the station. Unlike most platforms on Giant, these were layered, steps leading up to new areas, so that you could get some sense of the scale from the railcar, even if you couldn't see how far it stretched to either side, which I knew was very far indeed. There had, after all, been many species on Earth, once. Even the small subset of that number whose genetic information had been collected before they were driven out of existence, and the far smaller fraction of those who had been resurrected for the mausoleum, still resulted in an extremely large panoply of species. An extraordinary amount of space had been dedicated to recreating their habitats in this entirely hostile environment. It was an almost unthinkable extravagance on a planet where there was no land that had not been constructed. Agricultural and residential space were still considered dreadfully scarce. But the mausoleum had been created in a post-traumatic moment. Khafra had been a part of the biopreservationist movement at the end of the world, and used their moral and scientific legitimacy to argue that keeping the species of Earth in their potential form in seed banks and on data caches was not enough, that as many examples as possible should be gestated into living plants and animals. Moreover, during the initial settlement, scientists, biological and social, were deeply, almost hysterically concerned about the consequences of living on a planet with no other life larger than microbes. Gestating Earth species was considered necessary for humans. Now, with cats and cockroaches infesting almost every platform, the extravagant facilities developed to address that concern seemed laughable. But the administration of the Preservation Institute had guarded its historic privilege jealously, and their links with Valdegeld, the university where Platy works, helped protect it as well. How, after all, would Earth ever be restored if the animals and plants could not be reconstituted or could not be cared for once they were? How could the project of restoration and reseeding, the entire purpose of the vaunted field of classical studies, be understood without access to this living resource? And many non-scholars visited as well, finding some importance in seeing for themselves these creatures and plants, even if they were not quite in their native habitat. A respite, perhaps, or a warped window on what our lost life on Earth might have been like. I had visited often enough for my work that I had my routine of where to look on approach. Out the right side of the car and up to the mid-level platform, where, if I was lucky, I would catch the wide stripes of a zebra. The feeding trough for the mammoths just beyond that. Then, to the left, where a field of wildflowers bordered the rail. Just beyond them, the jaguar could sometimes be spotted if it chose to lounge near the edge of its habitat. Back to the right for the giant tortoise. And, almost invisible at the very upper limit of the window, a dark blur that I knew to be a vat of fantastically rare and expensive soil, literal earth populated with worms. There were, of course, animal rights activists who argued that the animals shouldn't have been reconstituted to live in what was essentially captivity. This perspective had not picked up many adherents, probably, I always thought, because many of the species in the mausoleum had more space to wander around in than most human residential platforms offered. If they were in captivity on this inhospitable planet, then so were we. We're going to skip a little bit to not give away too much and continue after the meeting that they were going to at this institute. It was well past midnight when we left the meeting. I was weary, my sleep on the train not having been very restful, and Malsa must have been too. I hadn't even asked which diurnal she was on. And yet it seemed a shame to drag her back to Valdegeld so quickly. Have you ever been here? I asked. We could walk one of the tourist paths before we return, if you like. Malsa acquiesced willingly enough. Odd for her, she was usually single-minded to a fault. And I chose one of the shorter circuits in deference to our long day of working. It had been some time, years, I realized, since I had walked around the mausoleum without some specific purpose and destination in mind, and despite my familiarity with the environment, I still found it impressive. The paths we walked, made of the same coated and reinforced metal as all platforms, had been carved or pressed with the images of various classical organisms, or of the traces they might leave, creating the illusion of fossils in the ground or footprints and spoor leading to a watering hole. The illusion that there was some ingrained history of life on this planet. Lamps guttered bluely at intervals, leaving the pathway dim, but the habitats, all some distance away and protected by transparent walls, glowed brightly with an approximation of what sunlight would look like on Earth. I found the walk and the unaccustomed images helped to clear my head. Perhaps that was Mossa's reasoning. But odd that Mossa should think that. She didn't. Of course she didn't. You think something important happened here, I said suddenly, breaking our ruminative silence. To Bolian, before he left. You think his time here was decisive? It seems likely, Mossa responded, but I am far from certain. You did mention he looked unusual when you saw him at the station before he came here. I nodded, wondering if I had been correct or was recording over my memory in light of what I now knew. In any case, it deserves an hour for getting a better sense of this place. I will say, she added, looking down the deliberately twisting path ahead of us, he certainly does not seem the type to wander aimlessly around a place which he visits frequently. Unless he was truly distraught, I suggested, but when Mossa turned her skeptical glance on me, I held up my hands immediately. No, I agree. He must have come here for a reason. I hope we may find out soon whom he met with, what they spoke of. Indeed, Mossa replied, and I cast her a sharp look, unconvinced by her tone, but dimness had overtaken us, and I couldn't read her expression. It is late, she added, turning her face briefly to the dragonfly enclosure, its walls pocked with magnifiers. Shall we return? Yes, I agreed with a sigh. Sila would contact us if anyone responded, and there seemed no reason to remain at the Institute to wait. It would be awkward whether I offered her a place to stay or didn't. I attempted, therefore, to determine which outcome I would prefer. Normally, I enjoy my solitude. In particular, I was still enamored of my scholars' rooms, so much more comfortable than the very tolerable space I had enjoyed at Valdegeld as a student. I savored my every arrival in them, closed the door behind me with a sense of sufficiency and safe enclosure. There was a small guest room with a narrow bed attached, and while I gloried in the idea of inviting someone, in student days we had to reserve the shared guest room of the hall or content ourselves with blankets on the floor. I had not yet had occasion to do so, and my rooms felt inviolate. And yet, though my eyes sagged with weariness, the thought of spending this evening alone chimed incomplete. It must be, I told myself, the allure of the mystery. Surely Mossa had some additional reflections that she might share in the ease of an overnight. And in any case, Mossa hardly counted as a guest. You'll stay at mine, of course, I said, therefore, as jovially as I could manage as we turned back towards the station. The assumption of normalcy was, I thought, my best strategy. I remembered also that I should clarify the situation. As a scholar, I have space for a guest, only a closet, really, but you'll be quite comfortable, and you still owe me that meal. Mossa grunted. As soon as we can manage it without events overtaking us, she said, and I had turned to ask whether she expected events to occur soon and of what sort, when a blur sprang through the air, slamming her to the hard metal of the platform. I found myself breathless, but managed to topple towards her, screaming in some combination of alarm and anger. There were, I remembered as I staggered forward, emergency buttons studded on the railing along the walkways. My fingers found the hard edge of one and swept across it as I directed a kick, poorly aimed and worse balanced, at the vibrating clutch of muscle and pelt that crouched on Mossa's curled body. The animal hissed at me, but my boots were heavy ones, and it was at least distracted enough to focus its eyes and its claws towards me. I kicked again, swiped my sleeve-wrapped arm in its general direction in an attempt to frighten it. I was still bellowing for assistance, but I couldn't imagine anyone coming. I bethought myself of another weapon and snatched an ignition from my pocket. In the platform's oxygenated atmosphere, it created only a small spark, but I waved it as close to the beast as I dared, hoping to trigger some epigenetic fear of flame. It bared its glistening sharp teeth at me. Some sort of feline, my classically trained brain informed me, and then, quick as lightning, it whipped back to look over its shoulder and sprang into the night. I collapsed to the platform, choking with residual shock, before I could stop myself and drag myself to Mossa's side without coming upright. To my relief, she was already rolling, and in a moment I saw her face, draped in her Atma scarf, and apparently unscathed. I found I was running my hands over her shoulders and arms to assure myself she was unharmed, most naturally, and I stopped myself at once. "You're well?" Malsa was uncurling herself and managed a sitting position. "Unharmed, and very grateful that this facility apparently keeps their caracals well fed. And to you, of course." The afterthought was so typical of Malsa, and, if I was fair, in this case so accurate, that I barely felt its sting. "I take it that's not a usual occurrence." I laughed, felt the giggles of released tension on its edge, and stopped quickly. "Hardly. You're really unhurt. Can you stand?" I helped her to her feet and held her arm as we started back towards the station. I kept glancing around for a swift-moving shadow, and she repeated her question. "No," I said more clearly, "I have never heard of an animal getting loose here. Although, She had not disengaged her arm, but she wasn't leaning on me either, or at least not much. I looked around again. "I suppose it's not the sort of thing they would want people to know about." "Certainly not." When we reached the station, I wanted to settle Malsa in the waiting train while I informed the staff about the escape, but she wouldn't hear of it, and so we both went into the administrative building and told the first person we found. It was a little difficult to extricate ourselves, what with their anxiousness to confirm that we wouldn't spread the event all over the rings, but we managed to board the train just before it left. "Altogether, a very instructive visit," Malsa said. She was sitting very straight on the cushioned bench, as though to deny any hint of tiredness, but she had to be exhausted. "We'll go straight to my rooms and order something to eat there," I said encouragingly. "You can bathe while we're waiting for the food, and then sleep." I shook my head, the horror of the feline's sudden attack striking me again. "Malsa, of all the things to happen." "Not so surprising, really, given the setting." "Very surprising. I still can't believe you weren't injured." "It wasn't hunting. It was startled." "Startled by what?" She didn't answer.
Fantastic. Very good reading. And also it's like you left on a nice little teasy cliffhanger, but I love that. That's what a good reading is all about. And something for me that really popped out of this reading was your attention to the relationship between these two characters. You mentioned that they are exes, and so there's a lot of history there. And just through the way that you've portrayed them, you slip in a lot of details about that history through their current interactions. So for you, how important was it to really hone in on that relationship and make it feel as natural as possible?
I think it's a big part of the book. It's a very cross-genre book, right? And if I had to pick something as a single one, it's probably the mystery that's the most important part of the plot. But I really do think that the relationship between the two of them, the romance, is really important to it too.
Mhm.
And I think that it was also really important to me in writing a romance to have it feel natural and to have it feel, not sort of an easy color by numbers sort of step, step, step. But I really, I like thinking about the romances that get less play, of which X's
Mhm.
is not really one. Like X's is a pretty solid
Yeah.
choice, I think. But I I like to think about these people who have a physical attraction, but also like they know that there's some emotional and sort of personality stuff that they clash on, and they're trying to
Mhm.
figure out how they work through it. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really rewarding part of the book to write.
Oh, I can imagine. And Stephanie Burgess, hi Stephanie, how are you? She's asking which came first when you were coming up with this idea, the Holmes Watson dynamic, the setting, or something completely different?
So the origin of this, it's a great question. The origin of this story goes way back to an idea that I had that was actually part of the reason I like choosing this scene to read also is, I had this idea like very, very vague about how would you live on a gas giant? Okay, you'd have to have these rings and then platforms. And then this thought of like a place where animals would be kept because
Hmm.
because, people would want animals and plants. And if they weren't running wild, on a planet, people would want to have them somewhere. And then, of course, other people would be like, no, we should be living in these spaces instead. And so I had this idea for the dynamic of a place and this sort of, this sort of yearning for something that we have co-evolved with and that is fundamentally necessary for our lives, and figuring out how to bring it to this place. So the setting kind of came first, but that was like years ago, and it was just this paragraph document for years. And then at some point I was like, okay, I want to write this, and what am I going to write? And it was like late 2020, I think, so everyone was miserable, and I was like, okay, I'm going to lean into every single comfort read trope that I have. And one thing that I don't even know why, but like total catnip for me are Holmesian stories, right? I think there's a lot of really great ones that have come out in the past few decades, but there's also like a whole history of older ones, most of which are like significantly better than the original Holmes stories.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You go back and read them. And so it's really interesting to me to think about why that is, like why this sort of very general framework has stuck with us in such a way and inspired such really fantastic stories. And I think one of the things that's really important to that is actually the relationship between these two protagonists, whether it's romantic or not. But certainly like having these two people who have some kind of balance for each other and who have some kind of, friendship and also working relationship, and also, probably they're navigating some kind of roommate situation. And okay, let's be honest, a lot of them are romantic, but even the ones that aren't, that I think that kind of relationship is really interesting, and it adds a lot to this sort of, we're going to have a mystery every time framework. So yeah, it just felt like a great way to go for me.
Yeah, I love it. And Stephanie said, I love that it's a gas lamp mystery and a literal gas giant.
Yeah, it was
very tongue-in-cheek.
Like just figuring out how to get that atmosphere. And it feels like a very natural atmosphere too, but foggy, and yes, everything is powered by gas because obviously you have a lot of it there. And also, telecommunications do not work so well in this place. So you're going back to telegrams because you've got to do stuff by wire because the atmosphere is not conducive. So yeah, it was a really fun way to do something that felt retro, but also let me do a ton of world building without having to research Victorian England, which I did not feel like
doing. Just pop it on Jupiter and forget about it. I love that though, but it's like the everything fed naturally into each other in terms of befitting a genre bending type of story.
Yes.
And for you, once you were kind of fleshing this out from that initial paragraph, why did a novella format feel right in terms of the necessary length to tell this story well? But also, I have a feeling you're going to do more stuff in this world in the future.
I am. Actually, we just announced the sequel, which is called The Imposition of Unnecessary Obstacles.
Nice.
And should come out about a year after this one. And it's I mean, this is, if it's Holmesian, there need to be more stories, right? But yeah, it's, I think also it was part of the sort of lockdown feeling of I wanted to write something that was relatively quick and sort of accessible and something that people could just grab and read. And so, which is also, I mean, it's definitely part of the genre, but each will be standalone, although I am building the characters in the world throughout. But each mystery is standalone because that's the tradition. But, I kind of had in my head, like, okay, I'm going to write something short. It's going to be complete. And it just turned out to fit the size really well. Like I didn't have to trim or mess with it. That's how it came out. If it had gone over the limit, I just would have made it a short novel or whatever it turned out to be. But it felt really good at this length. So
you just naturally just came together that way. It's very lucky on your part too. It's like, well, less work for me. Great.
really?
This one's a little bit more of a you question. This is from Fraser on Twitter. He's asking, how do you balance your humanitarian work, your work in general, with your fiction writing? How do you choose what to prioritize in terms of what you dedicate your time to with family and with work and all that kind of stuff?
So it's a great question. I haven't done active humanitarian work in quite a number of years, although I've done some remote work like reports or assessments or things that I could do. But mostly what I'm dividing my time now work-wise is between writing and kind of very broadly academic work. I teach and I try to do some academic writing as well, although I find it really difficult to make myself when it doesn't pay. Like when you've seen some fiction contracts, as problematic as they are, and then you look at an academic publishing contract, it's like horrific. So reform academic publishing, please, everybody. But I do try to continue my research and work on that as well as the teaching. And the writing itself, it's really a balance between writing the longer form things that I write, on spec pretty much, and then try to sell, but that are books, and then getting asked to write short stories or essays or getting asked to speak, and sort of the amount of time that stuff takes up. And also all the admin of like reading contracts and following up on payment and doing taxes. So it's when I think about balancing things, what I think about usually is like making sure that I have enough time for the stuff that is totally coming out of me, totally like, this is the thing that I want right now for whatever reason. I don't know where it comes from, but here it is, and I want to work on it. Maybe it'll get published, maybe it won't. And the stuff that's like, okay, if I write a story to these specifications within this time frame, I will get a payment of this much immediately. And so, yeah, just balancing those things along with the teaching and the other academic stuff.
Right on. No, I'm glad that you sound very, at least like, controlled in terms of these are the things that logically make sense. And I know you're a very logical person, so this is like, I'm not going to do anything that wastes my time.
No, I mean, I wish I could do nothing that wastes my time, but then I would have to
as little as possible, at least,
or something, because I get very frustrated with how much and I don't say this in an anarchist way, because I really think that taxes and sort of collective stuff is really important. But I also know from experience of living in other places that a lot of the stuff that we have to do is unnecessarily complicated. And particularly if you work for yourself, there's so much extra stuff that really goes above and beyond what it should be to run a business. So yeah, that pisses me off. But I think that I have no real system for prioritizing stuff. And I often am like, oh my gosh, why do I suddenly have everything due at once? But I also do try to listen to myself, and I'm trying to get better at saying no to short-term stuff when I feel like I really need to spend more time on the writing that's more personal or more self-driven and longer form.
Yeah. Well, Malka, thank you so much for taking the time. Speaking of which, taking the time to do this and spending time with me and
pleasure, for real. And thank you for having me. It was great. It's great to talk about the book. It's so exciting when you have a book out. I will just remind everyone too that we're currently in the pre-order sale days for Barnes & Noble. So if you're looking to pre-order stuff, now is a great time, and pre-ordering is great for authors. So keep that in mind. And yeah. Thanks.
Cool. Well, once again, that is the Mimicking of Known Successes. Malka, can you tell everyone the exact release date and which formats it's going to be available in?
So it's out on March 7th in hardcover and also ebook and also audio. And you can follow me on Twitter or look up my website and join my newsletter for more updates. And and hopefully the sequel, we'll have more on the sequel pretty soon.
Yeah, and if you want to read some of Malka's back catalog. You can go check out the Centenal Cycle. I highly recommend it. It's a complete trilogy, so at least you can start it and know you can finish it. 9-Step Station is amazing, although you renamed it, right?
Yeah, I think they call it 9-Step Murders now.
Okay, 9-Step Murders. And if you want to hear Malka chatting about cyberpunk, you can go listen or watch episode 26 of SFF Addicts. And Malka was also on the first panel of TBRCon2023 talking about the future of near future sci-fi, so you can go check that out as well. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the questions. And Malka, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure as always.